He sang of sunshine, mountains, and country roads. But the man who wrote those songs had a life much darker than most ever imagined. John Denver was beloved as America's soothing voice of peace and nature. But his life ended in one of the most preventable tragedies in music history. What took him from global fame to a horrific fall that no one could have anticipated? A nervous kid with a guitar. John Denver was born Henry John Dutzkondorf Jr. on December 31st, 1943 in Roswell, New Mexico, into the family of a decorated U.S. Air Force pilot. Captain Henry Dutch Dutzkondorf, John's father, was a war hero in military communities, breaking speed records in the B-58 Hustler bomber, and eventually a member of the Air Force Hall of Fame. But for young John, life within a military family was not comfortable. Constant moves meant he never got to stay in one place long enough to build close friendships. By the time he was 10, he had already lived in Arizona, Alabama, Oklahoma, and Texas, always having to pack up just as things were becoming home. The instability made him shy and uncertain, holding in him a sense of aloneness that would follow him all his life. One present did change everything. At 11 years old, when he was in Tucson, Arizona, his grandmother handed him an antique Gibson guitar from 1910. For a boy who was rootless, the instrument was his anchor. He started playing and singing, later joining the Tucson, Arizona Boys Chorus, where he was taught harmony and showmanship. John was singing folk tunes in tiny clubs by the time he got to high school, learning that music provided him with something his wanderlust childhood life never did: a sense of belonging. But even as music beckoned, the specter of his stern father hung over him. Dutch insisted on perfection in all things, and the gentle nature of his son conflicted with that military training. Their relationship was strained, yet they found one tenuous connection: flight. John learned to fly small planes, and for a time, father and son found a common link in the air. But the same aviation enthusiasm that brought them together would later be the instrument of John's destruction. No matter how hard his father insisted on discipline, John's soul was unruly. He went to Texas Tech University to pursue architecture, but the lectures and blueprints failed to capture his interest. On the side, he played with a local folk band, the Alpine Trio. To John, the guitar was more than just an extracurricular activity. It was the only map that led him to where he was truly destined to go, pursuing the dream in California and the initial breakthrough. By the mid-1960s, John Denver had come to a fork in the road. His studies at Texas Tech University in architecture were losing momentum as music took up more of his time. Late nights gigging with the Alpine Trio made him realize that his destiny lay not behind the drafting table, but on the stage. Frustrated and determined, he took the gutsy step of dropping out of school and going to Los Angeles. That trip would alter the course of history. In Los Angeles, he was just another one of thousands of aspiring musicians with a guitar and a dream. But unlike most, John had both discipline and determination. He auditioned along with over 200 singers to become the replacement for Chad Mitchell in the Chad Mitchell Trio, a best-selling folk group of the time. Miraculously, he was selected. It was his first major break, and he was able to tour the nation and make 3 albums with the group. These were trying times, challenging him to hone his voice and toughen himself up on the stage. It was during this time that John started composing his own songs. One of them, composed while waiting in a Washington, D.C. airport with no one to spend the time with during a solo layover, would be the turning point in his early career. The song was initially titled Babe, I Hate to Go, but later had its title changed to Leaving on a Jet Plane. Although his own renditions of it were not noticed, fate took its turn when the famous folk group Peter, Paul, and Mary cut their version in 1967. By December of 1969, their cover had reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, vindicating John Denver with the credibility that he so desperately lacked. Suddenly, the humble Air Force boy had established himself as a songwriter who could communicate with millions. At this point, he knew Dutzkondorf was too cumbersome for the music industry. Following the advice of trade folks, and out of affection for the mountains he adored, he shortened it to John Denver after Colorado's capital city. It was easy, relatable, and would soon be legend. By the late 1960s, Denver was more than just another dreamy strummer in Los Angeles. He had a hit record going around the world and a name that suited his image of wide, open spaces and untouched beauty. More importantly, he had momentum. The next move would make him a top solo artist of the 1970s. The making of a superstar. John Denver's solo career really took flight in 1971 with the release of his breakout record, Poems, Prayers, and Promises. Included on that album was a tune that would become an anthem, Take Me Home, Country Roads. Written by him along with Bill Danoff and Taffy Nivert, the song nearly failed. There were sound issues with early recordings, and people questioned whether it would ever take hold. But Denver's new manager, Jerry Weintraub, was a believer in the song. He campaigned strenuously to have it air on the radio beginning in Denver, Colorado. The risk paid off. The song was released in April 1971 and slowly but surely made its way up the charts to reach number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 by late August. It quickly went gold that month after it sold over 1 million copies. Its legacy grew over the years, finally selling more than 1.5 million digital copies in the United States and becoming one of the official state songs of West Virginia. The plaintive chorus of Homesickness resonated universally, and Denver's soothing voice sang it into living rooms across the land. Success was followed by more success. In September 1972, Denver released Rocky Mountain High. It was his 6th studio album and the first to reach the top 10 in the U.S., peaking at number 4 on the Billboard 200. The title track, inspired by his love for Colorado, resonated deeply with listeners who shared his reverence for nature. By 1973, the song had entered the top 10 on the Hot 100, and many years later would be designated as one of Colorado's 2 official state songs. But the true golden era came in 1974 and 1975. In just 18 months, Denver achieved something almost unheard of for number 1 singles on the Billboard Hot 100. Sunshine on My Shoulders reached the top in March 1974. Annie's song, written in just 10 minutes as a love letter to his first wife, Annie Martel, followed in July. Next was Thank God I'm a Country Boy in May of 1975, a celebration of plain country living, and I'm Sorry in September of that year. The songs demonstrated the depth of his capability, from sentimental ballads to upbeat anthems. Denver's albums were also preponderating on the charts at this time. His greatest hits album of 1973 became RCA's all-time best-selling album, even topping Elvis Presley. Back Home Again in 1974 became triple platinum, and Windsong in 1975 became double platinum. By the mid-1970s, John Denver was ubiquitous on the radio, TV, and in homes of millions. His smile, wire-framed glasses, and embroidered Western shirts were as familiar as his music. Fame, Hollywood, and the fissures behind the facade. By the late 1970s, John Denver was not only a singer, he was a household name. His music had bridged generations, and RCA was happy to promote him as their golden boy. However, Denver was not happy to be just in the music business. In 1977, he made his acting debut with the movie Oh, God, where he played alongside comedy icon George Burns. Directed by Carl Reiner, the film was about an ordinary grocery store manager selected by God to spread a message of God. Denver did not have an acting background, but his natural warmth and honesty made the performance credible. The movie turned out to be a box office hit, collecting more than $51 million within the U.S. and earning an Oscar nomination for its script. Although Denver never came back for the sequels, the part convinced him that he could be successful away from music. Television also contributed significantly to his success. His 1975 special, An Evening with John Denver, was awarded a Primetime Emmy Award. And in the 1970s and 1980s, he hosted various specials that introduced his music and tales into living rooms everywhere. People responded to his warmth and sincerity. Overseas fans welcomed him as well, particularly in the United Kingdom and throughout Europe. Gratefully to well-planned TV specials that were organized by his manager Jerry Weintraub, Denver's popularity reached such enormity that his looks, long blonde locks, sweet smile, and Anna Zapp-designed embroidered Western shirts, became legendary, and he was the signpost for sincerity and love for nature. But behind the halcyon image, things were starting to crack. His union with Annie Martel, which was the epitome of romance, started falling apart in the face of fame. Denver composed Annie's song for her in 1974. However, by the early 1980s, their marriage had turned bad. Friends remembered how Annie was overshadowed by his work. They divorced in 1982 in acrimony and exposed a not-so-gentlemanly side of Denver. Stories were heard about his temper, including one well-known incident when he carved their wedding bed in two with a chainsaw following a fight. The soft-voiced singer the world loved was revealing glimpses of fury in his offstage moments. Through the decade, Denver also encountered professional obstacles. The music world was trending toward the synthesizer-heavy beats of the 1980s, and his folk country sound was more and more regarded as out of place. In 1986, RCA, his record company for 25 years, let him go even though he had the platinum records and huge sales under his belt. Denver was shocked. He had just completed what he thought would be his follow-up hit record, One World, to hear the company was breaking up. From being their biggest star, outselling Elvis Presley for a time, Denver was now discarded as yesterday's news. Obsession with flying run-ins with the law, and the eventual slide downward. Flying developed into more than a pastime for John Denver. It was his greatest sense of freedom ever. With instruction by his father, he had honed his flying skills through the years and gained licenses for single-engine aircraft, multi-engine planes, and gliders. By the 1990s, he had accumulated over 2,700 hours in flight, flying himself to concerts quite frequently. Friends remembered how Denver had appeared most alive when he was behind the controls of an airplane, his hands firm, his eyes on the horizon. But what had once been a passion increasingly became an obsession. In 1993, Denver's demons caught up with him. He was charged with driving under the influence, a charge that led to a guilty plea, probation, and a fine. A year thereafter, in 1994, he wrecked his Porsche into a tree after reportedly drinking again. The accidents caught the eye of the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, which mandates that pilots have a valid medical certificate to fly legally. The FAA started investigating Denver's drinking past, wondering if he was healthy enough to stay behind the wheel. By 1997, they had made up their minds. His medical certificate was formally revoked, grounding him from flight. But Denver disobeyed. For months, he would not sign for certified letters from the FAA, which held up the revocation process in a bureaucratic loophole. But in March 1997, he finally signed for one of those letters, and then every flight he took was against the law. To have his license back, he would have had to demonstrate his sobriety in terms of testing and compliance. But he never bothered. Denver's disobedience was not just about forms. It was also a sign of a pattern of risk-taking behavior that disturbed those around him.